Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Shadhavar by Mythology Loves Horror. 2 weeks ago, I went camping at Zargos Mountains as part of a last-minute post-college unwinding session. I was getting ready to start working at a local law firm, but I wanted to see a little more of the world before too much time passed. On an impulse, I bought myself a ticket, and 3 days later, I was flying out of the Boston International Airport. 29 hours later, I was standing at one of the trailheads, which started in the southwestern corner of the Iranian Plateau and ran for 14 miles until it merged with another trail. While I didn't have any idea about the local geography, I did have some pretty good navigation items on me, and the path was so straightforward that I wasn't worried about getting lost. My plan was to take 2 days to hike this trail. Then I'd head on to one of the big cities and some of the nightlife. I'd maybe find myself a girl or two to show me around. Then I'd head back home by the end of the week. It was a foolproof plan. And I couldn't wait for my first night in the woods. Everything went perfectly that day. I covered the first 7 miles. Then I set up camp in a small grove of oak trees. I hadn't seen another person out there, and the trail looked less used than I'd expected. But I loved how much wildlife I'd seen. I made a fire and heated up one of my dad's MRE dinners. And to my surprise, the military packaged beef stew didn't taste bad at all. Before heading to bed, I made sure that everything was stored away carefully so that animals wouldn't try to get into anything. I fell asleep within minutes of crawling into my tent. Sometime later, I woke up and it took a moment to remember where I was. I lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of my slumber. After a few minutes, I didn't hear anything, so I wrote it off as a dream and fell back into a light sleep. The next time I woke, I could see the moon shining through the tent window, and I could hear soft, lovely music. My first thought was that it sounded like the kind of flute you hear in Celtic songs. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded ethereal and out of sync. It was as though multiple instruments were playing, and the rest of the nocturnal forest sounds had ceased. I untangled myself from my sleeping bag and I carefully unzipped my tent so that it didn't make any abrupt noise. I didn't think I was in any particular danger, but I wanted to be cautious, since it was admittedly weird to randomly hear music in the middle of nowhere at roughly 3 a.m. I let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. With it being a full moon, I could see my campsite well enough. Everything was in place, and I didn't see anyone around. The music sounded like it was coming from far off to one side of the clearing, and it didn't sound particularly close. I popped my head back into my tent long enough to grab boots and a flashlight. Then I closed the tent up behind me and began following the music. I was intensely curious, and I figured that if I maintained a good distance from the sound, no one would ever know I was there. I crept along the edge of the clearing, trying to keep to the shadows while making my footfalls light. I followed the haunting music into the darkness, my senses on overdrive as I tried to track it. I wasn't the best woodsman, but I liked to think I could handle this. After about 10 minutes, I came to a halt, my chest squeezing in a moment of blinding panic. Whomever was playing the music was probably perfectly friendly, but on the off chance that they weren't, I realized I was defenseless. Sure, I could always punch them, but that wouldn't do me much good if they had another weapon on them or could take a hit. I began checking the ground near me, and I soon found a sturdy, thick branch that seemed like it could do some damage if necessary. I tucked it under my arm, cradling it to me as I advanced. It took me another 5 minutes, but I soon found out the source of the music. As I got closer, I shut my flashlight off, and I waited to see who was there. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. I had expected a person to be sitting at the campfire playing music, but all I saw was a deer. The clearing, it was flooded with moonlight, and the lighting was bright enough that I wish I had my camera with me. After a minute, it raised its head from the berry bush it had been grazing on, and that was when I saw it wasn't a deer. Its single antler was long and spiraled, almost like that of a gazelle, but I could see that each prong had a hole in it. The antler was acting like a pan flute, since it made a musical sound whenever the breeze blew across them. I studied it in fascination, and that's when I realized that we weren't alone. Along the edge of the clearing, several animals had poked out their heads, and they were cautiously surveying their surroundings. They were all drawn towards the deer-like creature, and they seemed to be as interested in the music as I was. Each time the wind blew, the animals crept a little closer, and soon I could see there was a weird mix of them. There was a couple of striped hyenas, a snake, some Persian fallow deer, some rabbits, and even a cow. I didn't even realize that Iran had whatever the deer thing was, much less hyenas, so that came as a surprise. As I tried to identify the rest of the animals, a violent gust of wind began blowing, and the once silent animals instantly turned agitated. Over the enraged sound of hisses, growls, bellows, and thumps, I could hear the music soar, but now it had a heavier, more aggressive quality to it. The animals began to turn on each other, and soon it was a war. Biting, clawing, kicking, and stomping began to kill them off, until only 2 animals remained. The cow and one of the hyenas stood panting as they faced off against each other. They were covered in bloody gashes, and the cow looked like it was missing an eye. As the violent song died down, the cow shook its head as if it was trying to get a fly out of its ear, and the hyena let out a confused, scared whimper. Throughout the carnage, the horned thing had stood in the same spot, and I don't think it had moved a muscle. It finally stepped away from the bush, carefully stepping over carcasses and gore, until it stood in front of the remaining animals. They held their ground, and the hyena began growling. The deer-like creature shook its head, and a piercing whistle-like sound came from its horn. It startled the animals, who both skittered away. I had no idea what I had just witnessed. It had happened so brutally and quickly that it had been hard to keep track of any one animal, and I had to force myself to keep breathing steadily so that I wouldn't vomit. I'd never seen bloodshed like that, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. As I began to back away, the creature daintily made its way to the center of the clearing, and to my disgust, it began feeding on the slain animals. I could hear bones snapping wetly, and that was when my stomach betrayed me. I vomited, and when I finally stopped heaving, it was gone. I could smell the blood and viscera in the air, which sent my stomach into another wave of nauseated cramps. I made it back to my tent practically crawling at some points. And that night I barely slept. What little sleep I did get was filled with nightmares. And without hesitation, I cut my trip short. When I had internet service again, I spent some time trying to find what that creature was. It seemed like it was a Shadhavar. The easiest way to explain it is by calling it a carnivorous unicorn. And they were thought to have gone extinct hundreds of years ago. The type of animals they like eating respond to their sound of their horn, and that's when it's too late for the prey to escape. It's a fascinating creature, but I hope I never see one again. Closer Than I Knew by, again, Mythology Loves Horror. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, and I aced all of my exams. As soon as the last sergeant had shaken my hand at graduation, I had a job offer, and I eagerly agreed to fly across the country so I would be seen as dependable. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or black bears don't kill you, then there's plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought it would be all pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup. But I was wrong. I originally hail from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough chick, but I know that I am woefully unequipped to handle the things that lurk out there. The call that started my living nightmare should have been a standard domestic abuse case. But instead it ruined my entire perception of reality. In the 3.5 years I've been here for, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished to death by fallen trees, and cars that were totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought those were bad enough encounters, but I wasn't prepared to find myself in a situation that I was utterly unprepared for. I had daydreamed about how to get out of tons of different tricky, life-threatening scenarios before, but I had never envisioned myself in one that I straight up couldn't figure out how to handle. I didn't have any paperwork left to do last Saturday, and since I'm field-trained, I asked my friend, Officer T, if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field in a few months, and I had been itching for some action, now that my most recent class had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining into my mind that we needed to speak with a Mr. B, who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I rode for about 15 minutes, eventually finding ourselves in one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch black out. A concerned neighbor had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area back behind the houses. We had been under the impression that the fighting had occurred inside her neighbor's house, and she said that it had until about 10 minutes before our arrival. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard the screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a low-pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted about 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Normal protocol dictated that we would go next door and question the suspect. But under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize the public safety over the standard inquiries. We sprinted from the porch, making our way quickly, but carefully, as we could towards the sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams, which were getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved. And as we made our way into the woods, we quietly discussed if it could be an animal. The screams of a mountain lion can sound like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally approaching the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for somebody to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to them. But there was no more sound. I began checking for footprints, and there were only ours, and something that looked vaguely deer-like. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage. But even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area and hadn't seen any sign of a blood trail or struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomena that I was. And when we heard the exact copy of the scream from when we were on the porch, it came directly behind us. But there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate. And then there was another chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunch, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split second, I thought that I saw his eyes shining red in the beam from my flashlight. I dismissed the thought, knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him we needed to get out of there. He looked almost angry for a moment. Then he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he'd been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right, and I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get us through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway up to the house, the screams came again. It was so loud that it seemed to be right next to me, and I frantically shone my flashlight around. There was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was no glittering of animal eyes, no rushing of bushes, no sound of footfalls, just tense silence. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air, and it almost sounded like my name. It lasted for about 10 seconds straight, and it was much louder than before. By this time I was terrified, but I kept my wits about me enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. She never did call again, and I got us out of there as fast as the cruiser would safely go. I still don't know what was in those woods, but as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. One thing in particular which gives me the shivers is how it was completely silent between the screams. That might not seem odd, but during the harsh winters in Vermont, there's still always some sort of ambient sound when you're out in the forest, even if it's just the lonesome cries of non-migratory crows, or the wind causing bare branches to rub together. There's always something. That night, though, even back by Mrs. F's house, away from the source of the wailing, there was no sound. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, and he tells me I should be glad I got out of there alive, because the danger was closer than I knew. So quoth this raven. A big thank you to Alana, Mythology Loves Horror, for sharing these stories with me and asking me to read them. And thank you all for listening. I hope Tiffany's home and on the mend. And a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, Ermin Case, Darren, and Laura. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.